Picture this. 1700, somewhere in what we now call South Dakota. A Lakota warrior sits on a ridge at dawn, watching something that would change everything. Down below, moving across the grassland, is a herd of wild horses. Not deer, not buffalo. Horses. Animals his grandfather had only heard about in stories told by traders. Within a single generation, these woodland people who had been pushed westward by enemies with guns would transform into the most feared mounted warriors in North America. This is the story of that transformation and the invisible technology that would eventually end it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Lakota Sioux in 1700 were refugees. Let's be clear about that. They weren't the lords of the plains yet. They were woodland people from what's now Minnesota, being squeezed westward by the Ojibwe who had acquired French guns. The Lakota had a choice: adapt or disappear. They chose adaptation on a scale that's frankly breathtaking. The horse changed everything. And I mean everything. Within 50 years of acquiring these animals, the Lakota had developed a mounted warfare culture so sophisticated it would influence military tactics worldwide. We're talking about a people who went from hunting on foot to controlling 200,000 square miles of territory. That's roughly the size of Spain. They didn't do this through luck. They did it through brilliant strategy, political organization, and an ability to read the landscape that bordered on supernatural. Their governance system was remarkable. The 7 council fires brought together related bands in a federation that balanced independence with collective strength. Each council had its own territory, its own leadership, but they came together for major decisions. Think of it as a confederation that predated the United States Constitution by decades, operating on principles of consensus rather than majority rule. When the councils met, decisions weren't rushed. They talked until agreement emerged naturally. No votes, no forcing the minority to accept the majority's will. Just discussion until the path forward became clear to everyone. And underlying all of this was a philosophical framework that still resonates today. Mitakuye oyasin. All my relations. It's easy to romanticize this concept, but let me tell you what it actually meant in practice. Every decision considered 7 generations forward. Every buffalo hunt acknowledged the spirit of the animal and used every part. Every war party understood that the land itself was watching and would remember. This wasn't abstract philosophy. This was practical wisdom that sustained a civilization for over a century on what white settlers would later call a wasteland. The buffalo were central to everything. And when I say everything, I mean the Lakota built an economic empire around these animals that would make modern supply chain managers weep with admiration. A single buffalo provided meat that could feed a family for weeks when dried properly. The hide became lodge coverings, clothing, shields that could deflect arrows. The sinew became bowstrings. The bones became tools. The bladder became water carriers. Nothing wasted. But here's what's really impressive. The Lakota managed these herds. They understood migration patterns better than any biologist today. They knew which herds to hunt and which to leave alone to maintain population levels. They were conducting sustainable wildlife management before the concept even existed in European thought. Women held enormous power in this society, something that often gets glossed over. They owned the lodges. They controlled the household economy. They were the winter count keepers, the historians who maintained the pictographic records of each year's most important events on buffalo hides. When a man married, he moved into his wife's family lodge. If she wanted a divorce, she put his belongings outside the lodge entrance. Done. No courts, no legal battles. The women also processed every buffalo, a job requiring strength and skill that took years to master. A woman who could efficiently process a buffalo carcass had status, respect, and economic power. By 1850, the Lakota were at their absolute peak. 25,000 people living in a territory stretching from Minnesota to Montana, from Nebraska to Canada. They controlled the major trade routes. They had alliances with some tribes, military dominance over others. They had pushed the Crow westward, kept the Pawnee at bay, and were negotiating with the United States from a position of strength. Red Cloud was rising as a young war leader, brilliant and ambitious. Life followed the rhythm of seasons. Winter camps in sheltered valleys, spring moves to follow birthing buffalo herds, summer gatherings for ceremonies and trade, autumn hunts to prepare for winter. It was a civilization in perfect balance with its environment. But something was changing on the wind. Strange reports from eastern bands told of white settlements growing larger every year, wagons rolling westward in numbers that seemed impossible, treaties signed and broken, and something else, something the scouts couldn't quite explain. Tall poles appearing across the prairie, strung with wire that hummed and sang in the wind. The Lakota had faced many enemies before. They had adapted to every challenge. But how do you fight an enemy whose words travel faster than the fastest horse? How do you maintain the advantage of surprise when your enemy can send messages across distances in moments? The singing wires were coming, and they would change warfare itself in ways no warrior could have imagined. The first Lakota scout to encounter a telegraph pole probably thought he was looking at the strangest tree he'd ever seen. This was 1861, and the transcontinental telegraph was pushing westward at an incredible pace. Imagine being that scout. You're riding across land your people have controlled for generations, and suddenly there's this perfectly straight pole planted in the earth, with glass insulators catching the sunlight like ice, and copper wire stretching to the horizon in both directions. It hums. Not like wind through grass, not like any natural sound. It sings with a voice that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The initial reaction was curiosity mixed with suspicion. Warriors would ride up to these poles, circle them, try to understand their purpose. Some thought they were markers for the white man's roads. Others believed they were related to the talking leaves, the paper with marks that carried words. But the truth was more disturbing than anyone imagined. When mixed-blood interpreters who could read English finally explained what these wires did, the reaction wasn't disbelief. It was horror. Words traveling faster than eagles? Messages sent across distances that would take a horse days to cover, arriving in moments. This violated everything the Lakota understood about the natural order of the world. Let me tell you about a specific incident from 1862 that really captures this moment. A young warrior named Stands Alone climbed one of these poles. Not to cut the wire. Not yet. He wanted to understand it. He pressed his ear against the humming wire and heard something that terrified him. Clicking sounds, rapid and purposeful, like some insect spirit trapped inside the metal. He described it later as hearing the white man's thoughts traveling through the wire itself. He cut the line with his tomahawk, watched the wire fall and go silent. Within 3 days, repair crews arrived with armed escorts. 3 days. The Lakota controlled hundreds of miles in every direction, and somehow the white men knew exactly where the wire had been cut and sent men to fix it. That's when the strategic implications began to sink in. The military advantage this technology provided was devastating. Before the telegraph, coordination between army posts was impossible. Messages traveled by courier on horseback, taking days or weeks. The Lakota had always exploited this. Hit one fort, disappear into the plains, attack somewhere else before word could spread, classic guerrilla warfare. But the telegraph changed the entire equation overnight. Now, when warriors attacked a supply train in Nebraska, forts in Wyoming knew about it within the hour. Troops could be mobilized simultaneously across a front hundreds of miles wide. The Lakota's greatest tactical advantage, their mobility and the vast distances they could cover, suddenly became almost irrelevant. Red Cloud understood this faster than most. By 1866, he was leading the most successful war against the United States that any Native American leader would ever wage. He forced the army to abandon 3 forts and secured favorable treaty terms. But even in victory, Red Cloud knew something had changed. During the siege of Fort Phil Kearny, he watched telegraph messages flow in and out of that fort every day. He couldn't stop them, couldn't intercept them in any meaningful way. The fort could call for reinforcements, report Lakota positions, coordinate with other posts. The only time the Lakota had a true advantage was when they managed to cut the lines and attack before repairs could be made. It was a temporary solution to a permanent problem. Children were fascinated by the telegraph in ways that worried their elders. There are accounts of young Lakota touching the wire carefully, feeling the vibration, trying to understand this strange medicine. Some believed the humming was the voice of a spirit. Medicine men held councils debating the nature of these singing wires. Were they evil? Were they neutral tools that could be used for good or ill? Some argued that the wires themselves weren't the problem, that it was the messages they carried, the lies and broken promises that flowed through copper. Others insisted that the very presence of these wires was an affront to the natural world, that they disrupted the flow of spiritual energy across the land. And they weren't wrong about that disruption. The telegraph lines didn't just carry messages. They physically cut through sacred sites. They created barriers that disrupted buffalo migration routes. The poles became perches for predatory birds that wouldn't normally be found on the open prairie. The lines created new sounds in the landscape, a constant background hum that made it harder to hear, approaching danger. In a very real sense, the telegraph was fragmenting the spiritual and physical landscape, even before soldiers and settlers arrived to complete the conquest. There's a story about an intercepted message that I find particularly telling. In 1867, a mixed-blood scout named Joseph Iron Shell, who worked for Red Cloud, had learned to tap telegraph lines. He couldn't send messages, but he could listen. One night, he intercepted a message about a planned fort construction project that would cut directly through prime hunting grounds. The message detailed troop movements, supply shipments, everything. Iron Shell brought this information to Red Cloud, who used it to position warriors to harass the construction crews effectively. But here's the thing that haunted Iron Shell. He also intercepted messages about his own people, reports of Lakota movements, descriptions of individual warriors, intelligence gathered from other tribes and translated into English and sent across the wires. The army knew more about Lakota positions and plans than many Lakota leaders did. The information asymmetry was crushing. By 1870, telegraph lines crisscrossed Sioux territory like a spider's web. Every major fort was connected, every railroad, depot. Messages that once took weeks now took minutes. The army could coordinate winter campaigns with precision, hitting multiple villages simultaneously before word could spread by rider. They could track buffalo herds using reports from railway workers and telegraph their positions to commercial hunters. They could relay government orders from Washington to field commanders faster than Lakota scouts could carry warnings between bands. The cultural impact was profound. The Lakota had always lived in a world where information traveled at the speed of a horse or a runner. Strategy, survival, everything depended on human movement. The telegraph created a new reality where the enemy could think and act faster than the natural world allowed. It's hard to overstate how disorienting this was. Imagine your entire military doctrine becoming obsolete, not because you lost a battle, but because the fundamental rules of time and space had changed. That's what the telegraph did to the Lakota. And the worst part? The Lakota couldn't adopt this technology themselves. It required infrastructure they didn't have. Poles, wire, telegraph operators who could read and write English, stations with batteries and equipment. Even if they had captured all of this, where would they send messages? To what other stations? The telegraph was a network, and the Lakota weren't part of that network. They couldn't join it without surrendering the very independence they were fighting to preserve. It was a weapon they couldn't capture, couldn't counter, and couldn't escape. The singing wires kept spreading, and with them came the end of an era that had lasted less than a century, but had seemed, to those living it, as eternal as the prairie itself. The destruction of the buffalo wasn't an accident. Let me be very clear about that. It was policy, calculated, deliberate, and the telegraph made it possible on a scale that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. In 1870, there were still millions of buffalo on the Great Plains. By 1883, you could count the remaining wild herds on your fingers. 30 million animals reduced to fewer than 1,000 in little over a decade. This wasn't hunting. This was systematic extermination, and every step was coordinated through those humming copper wires. General Philip Sheridan said it outright: "Destroy the buffalo, destroy the Indians. He understood what the Lakota had always known. Everything depended on the buffalo: food, shelter, clothing, tools, trade goods, spiritual practices. The entire civilization was built around following and managing these herds. Take away the buffalo, and you take away the foundation of Lakota independence. The army couldn't have executed this strategy without the telegraph. Commercial hunters needed to know where the herds were. Railroad companies needed to coordinate shipping of hides. Army posts needed to protect hunters from Lakota warriors trying to defend their livelihood. All of this required instantaneous communication across vast distances. Let me tell you about 1873. A group of young Lakota warriors, maybe 20 in total, discovered one of the last significant buffalo herds in their traditional territory, several hundred animals moving slowly across the grassland. This should have been a moment of joy, of abundance. Instead, it became a nightmare. Within hours of the warriors spotting the herd, telegraph messages had alerted commercial hunting outfits working along the railroad line. Professional hunters arrived by train, armed with heavy rifles that could kill buffalo from distances. The Lakota couldn't match with bows or even captured army rifles. The warriors watched from a ridge as 500 buffalo were slaughtered in a single afternoon. Not for meat, for tongues, which were considered a delicacy in Eastern restaurants, and for hides. The rest was left to rot. Tons of meat wasting on the prairie while Lakota families went hungry on reservations. The telegraph enabled something even more devastating: winter campaigns. Before this technology, the army avoided winter operations. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. Troops could get lost in blizzards, supply lines could be cut, communication was impossible. Winter was when the Lakota were most vulnerable, camped in sheltered valleys, but it was also when they were safest from attack. The telegraph changed that calculation entirely. Now the army could coordinate simultaneous strikes on multiple winter camps, ensuring that survivors fleeing one attack would run directly into troops from another fort who had been alerted by wire. Weather that should have protected the Lakota became a trap. Deep snow that made escape difficult, freezing temperatures that killed children and elders during forced marches, all of it weaponized through coordination that was only possible via telegraph. The winter of 1876 was particularly brutal. After the disaster at Little Bighorn, where Custer and his men were wiped out, the army wanted revenge. Telegraph messages flew between Washington and field commanders. Orders were clear: find every Lakota village and force surrender. General Nelson Miles used the telegraph to orchestrate a campaign of relentless pursuit. Every time Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse moved their people, telegraph messages tracked them. Army scouts would spot a village, send word by the nearest telegraph station, and within hours, cavalry units were converging from multiple directions. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to rest. Families that had spent generations living free were being run to exhaustion by an enemy that never seemed to tire, never seemed confused about where they were. And then there were the lies. The telegraph made government duplicity more efficient and more devastating. Treaty negotiations that seemed to be conducted in good faith were undermined by messages flowing between Washington, bureaucrats, and field agents. Lakota leaders would negotiate terms, believing they had reached an understanding, only to discover that telegraph messages had already ordered different actions: promises of rations that never arrived, guarantees of territory that were violated before the ink dried. The telegraph didn't just coordinate military operations, it coordinated deception on an industrial scale. The forced marches to agencies were heartbreaking. Proud warriors who had once controlled the plains were herded like cattle to reservation lands, their movements tracked by telegraph every step of the way. If a group tried to slip away, messages would alert cavalry units to intercept them. The agencies themselves were strategic positions chosen partially for their proximity to telegraph lines. Control required communication, and communication required the wire. Families arrived at these agencies, starving, desperate, having watched their way of life systematically destroyed over the course of a decade. Children became weapons in this war. Starting in the late 1870s, the government began kidnapping Lakota children and sending them to boarding schools hundreds of miles away. The Telegraph coordinated these operations with chilling efficiency. Orders would be sent to agents on reservations: collect this many children by this date. Railroad schedules would be telegraphed to ensure trains were ready to transport the children eastward. Parents who resisted had rations withheld, were threatened with imprisonment, or simply had their children taken by force. At these schools, speaking Lakota brought beatings. Practicing any traditional ceremony meant punishment. The goal was explicitly stated: kill the Indian, save the man. And the Telegraph made it possible to do this to thousands of children across multiple reservations simultaneously. Sitting Bull's flight to Canada in 1877 seemed like it might offer refuge. Grandmother's country, the Lakota called it, referring to Queen Victoria. But even there, the Telegraph reached. Diplomatic messages flew between Washington and Ottawa. Pressure was applied. The buffalo in Canada were also being exterminated, partly through the same coordinated hunting efforts. By 1881, Sitting Bull and his followers were starving. He surrendered not to military force, but to the reality that there was nowhere left to run where the singing wires couldn't reach. When he crossed back into United States territory, telegraph messages had already informed every military post of his route and timing. The victory at Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors wiped out Custer's entire command, should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it brought terrible retribution. Telegraph messages spread news of the battle within hours. Newspapers in New York were printing details the same day warriors were still collecting weapons from dead soldiers. The public outcry demanded vengeance. Congress immediately allocated more funding for Plains campaigns. More troops were dispatched. The Telegraph had turned a military defeat into a public relations disaster that justified even harsher policies. By 1890, the situation was desperate. The ghost dance movement spread across reservations, a last desperate hope that supernatural intervention might restore the old world. Dancers believed that performing the ceremony would bring back the buffalo, resurrect dead ancestors, and make the white men disappear. It was born of pure desperation. Government agents, nervous about any gathering of Indians, sent frantic telegraph messages about the ghost dance. These messages, often exaggerated or completely false, created panic. Orders came back through the wire: stop the dancing, arrest the leaders. Sitting Bull was killed while being arrested in December 1890, shot in a confrontation that telegraph messages had helped precipitate. 2 weeks later came Wounded Knee. Bigfoot's band, fleeing after Sitting Bull's death, were intercepted by cavalry. Telegraph messages had coordinated the movement of troops to surround them. On December 29, 1890, in freezing weather, the army attempted to disarm the Lakota. A shot was fired, nobody knows by whom, and the Hotchkiss guns opened up. These were rapid-fire artillery pieces that had been positioned around the camp specifically because telegraph messages had allowed commanders to request them days in advance. 300 Lakota were killed, mostly women and children. Bodies were left frozen in the snow for days. The Telegraph carried news of the massacre across the country, but this time framed as a battle, a victory. The singing wires had coordinated the final military action of the Indian Wars, and then told the story in the language of conquest. The decades after Wounded Knee were dark, and I don't use that word lightly. Speaking Lakota was forbidden on reservations. Children were still being taken to boarding schools where their hair was cut, their names changed, their language beaten out of them. Traditional ceremonies were illegal. The sun dance, the most sacred ritual, could only be practiced in secret, in remote locations where government agents couldn't see. Elders who remembered the free life on the plains watched their grandchildren grow up knowing only poverty and dependence. The buffalo were gone. The land was gone. For many, it seemed like hope was gone too. But something survived. Call it resilience, call it stubbornness, call it the unbreakable core of a culture that had adapted before and would adapt again. The Lakota didn't disappear. They didn't assimilate completely. They held on to fragments of knowledge, passed down in whispers and secret gatherings. Old men taught young boys to pray in Lakota when no one was watching. Grandmothers sang traditional songs while working, keeping the melodies alive. The winter, counts continued. though now they recorded years of suffering rather than victories. The thread didn't break, it stretched thin, nearly invisible at times, but it held. World War II changed things in ways nobody expected. Lakota men volunteered for military service in numbers that surprised the government. They fought in Europe and the Pacific, proving themselves as warriors in a new kind of warfare. But here's what's interesting. When they came home, they came back with a different understanding of freedom and rights. They had fought for American democracy abroad. Now they started asking why they didn't have full citizenship rights at home, why their reservations were run by government agents who treated them like children, why their sacred sites were being developed or destroyed without consultation. These veterans had seen the world. They weren't going to accept the old system quietly. The 1960s and 70s brought a new kind of resistance: legal battles instead of military campaigns, media coverage instead of telegraph coordination. In 1973, members of the American Indian movement occupied Wounded Knee for 71 days, the same place where 300 Lakota had been massacred 83 years earlier. But this time, the technology worked differently. Television cameras broadcast images worldwide. The Telegraph had once coordinated the Army's attacks. Now television coordinated public opinion. People across America and around the world watched as the government surrounded Wounded Knee with military force. The occupation didn't succeed in all its goals, but it succeeded in making people pay attention. It put native rights back into the national conversation. The legal victories that followed were remarkable. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been taken illegally. The government offered compensation, over $1 billion with interest. The Lakota refused it, still refuse it to this day. The money sits in an account, growing larger every year, untouched, because the Black Hills aren't for sale. They never were. This isn't about money. It's about sacred land, about honoring the treaties, about maintaining a connection to place that goes back generations. That refusal, that principled stance, it says something profound about cultural survival. Tribal colleges started appearing in the 1970s. These weren't just schools, they were acts of cultural resistance and revival. At institutions like Sintigleska University and Oglala Lakota College, students learn quantum physics and computer science, alongside traditional star knowledge passed down from elders. They study Western literature and Lakota oral traditions. They're taught that there's no contradiction between honoring their heritage and mastering modern technology. In fact, the argument goes, the Lakota have always been adapters, innovators, the same people who transformed their entire civilization when they acquired horses can certainly master computers and internet technology. And they have. Modern Lakota use social media in ways their ancestors would recognize as similar to the old communication networks. Information spreads quickly through Facebook groups and Twitter feeds, coordinating efforts to protect sacred sites or organize cultural events. Language preservation efforts happen on YouTube, where elders record themselves speaking Lakota, teaching traditional stories, explaining ceremonies. These videos reach more people than any winter count or oral tradition session ever could. Young people in cities far from the reservations can hear their language, learn their history, maintain connection to their culture. The technology that once helped destroy their way of life is now helping preserve it. Environmental activism has become the new battlefield, and the Lakota are on the front lines. The fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016 brought thousands of people to Standing Rock. The water protectors, as they called themselves, used the same determination their ancestors showed at Little Bighorn, but instead of rifles they had cell phone cameras and live streams. The world watched in real time as protesters were attacked with water cannons in freezing temperatures. The pipeline was eventually completed, but the movement showed that the fight isn't over. Young Lakota are still defending their land, their water, their future. They're using every modern tool available while drawing strength from traditional teachings. The pandemic in 2020 brought another unexpected adaptation. Suddenly, everyone was isolated, separated, relying on technology to maintain connection. Elders who had never used computers before learned Zoom so they could teach language classes. ceremony adapted, with singers and drummers coordinating remotely. Young people recorded themselves dancing traditional dances and shared videos online, keeping the culture alive even when physical gatherings were impossible. An elder teaching ancient songs to a teenager via video call from 1,000 miles away. That's not a betrayal of tradition. That's tradition surviving, adapting, continuing. Today, there are efforts to restore buffalo herds on tribal lands. Not millions like the old days, but growing populations managed by Lakota who are relearning skills their great-grandparents possessed. There are language immersion schools where children speak only Lakota all day. There are artists creating work that blends traditional designs with contemporary themes. There are lawyers fighting in court for water rights and treaty enforcement. There are activists blocking pipelines and lobbying Congress. The methods have changed, but the spirit, that core determination to survive as a people, to maintain identity and sovereignty, that hasn't changed at all. The endless prairie was lost. There's no pretending otherwise. The life of following buffalo herds, of moving with the seasons, of ranging across 200,000 square miles of territory, that's gone, and it's not coming back. But the people who rode across that prairie, who built a civilization in harmony with the land, who fought with everything they had to maintain their freedom, those people are still here. Their descendants carry that same spirit forward into a very different world. And maybe that's the real victory, not in battles won or lost, but in simple, stubborn survival, in refusing to disappear, in adapting once again, as the Lakota have always done, to a world that keeps trying to write them out of existence. The singing wires once coordinated their destruction. Now their descendants use fiber optic cables and satellites to coordinate their renewal. The technology changed, the determination didn't.